85 seconds. That is how long humanity has left, not according to conspiracy theorists, not according to doomsayers on the internet, according to Nobel laureates, nuclear physicists, the scientists who helped build the atomic bomb and have spent 80 years trying to prevent its use. In January 2026, they moved the Doomsday Clock closer to midnight than it has ever been. Closer than the Cuban Missile Crisis, closer than the Cold War, the closest in human history. Nuclear weapons are spreading. Artificial intelligence is racing beyond control. The climate is crossing points of no return. And in laboratories around the world, scientists are debating whether to create a form of life that 38 researchers have called an existential threat to everything on Earth. This is not science fiction. This is the world you live in right now, and the clock is ticking. Chapter 1. The clock strikes. What you're about to hear is not science fiction. It is not a thriller designed to keep you awake at night. It is a warning issued by some of the most brilliant minds on Earth. A warning that humanity has never been closer to destroying itself. In the chapters ahead, we will trace the origins of a symbol that has haunted the world for nearly 80 years. We will examine the forces pushing civilization toward the edge, nuclear arsenals growing, artificial intelligence running unchecked, a planet heating toward points of no return, and in the shadows, something even stranger. A form of synthetic life that 38 scientists have called an existential threat to every living thing on Earth. This is the story of the Doomsday Clock and why it now reads 85 seconds to midnight. January 27, 2026, Washington, District of Columbia. A room filled with cameras and reporters. At a podium stands Alexandra Bell, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. Behind her, a symbolic clock face, the hands frozen at a position that sends a chill through everyone watching. 85 seconds to midnight, the closest the clock has ever been since its creation in 1947. Closer than the height of the Cold War, closer than the Cuban Missile Crisis, closer than any moment in human history. Bell speaks. Her voice is steady but carries weight. Every second counts, she says, and we are running out of time. It is a hard truth, but this is our reality. The room is silent. Journalists who have covered wars, disasters, political upheavals sit motionless because they understand this is not politics. This is not rhetoric. This is the considered judgment of Nobel laureates, nuclear physicists, climate scientists, and biosecurity experts. Before we go any further, take a second to subscribe to the channel. If you enjoy deep dive stories like this, hit like and stay with me, because what comes next only gets more unsettling. People who have dedicated their lives to understanding how civilizations survive or how they end. The Doomsday Clock is not a prediction. It does not tell you when the world will end. It tells you how close we are to the capacity for ending it. It measures the proximity of catastrophe, the accumulation of risk, the narrowing of the margin between humanity and oblivion. And in 2026, that margin has never been thinner. To understand the weight of 85 seconds, you have to understand what the clock measures. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists considers multiple existential threats, not just one. The original concern was nuclear weapons, the bomb that ended World War II and opened a new age of potential annihilation. But over the decades, the scientists expanded their assessment. Climate change entered the calculation in 2007. Disruptive technologies, including artificial intelligence, became a factor as these systems grew powerful enough to reshape or unravel civilization. Today, the clock considers all of these simultaneously. Nuclear war, climate collapse, uncontrolled AI, biological threats, both natural and engineered, and now something that did not exist when the clock was first set. The possibility of mirror life, synthetic organisms built from reversed molecular structures that could spread through ecosystems unchecked by any natural defense. The 2026 announcement cited all of these, but it emphasized something that ties them together. A failure of leadership, a collapse of international cooperation, a world fragmenting into hostile camps at precisely the moment when collective action is most desperately needed. Let me read to you from the official statement released that morning. A year ago, we warned that the world was perilously close to global disaster and that any delay in reversing course increased the probability of catastrophe. Rather than heed this warning, Russia, China, the United States, and other major countries have instead become increasingly aggressive, adversarial, and nationalistic. Hard-won global understandings are collapsing. Accelerating a winner takes all great power competition, and undermining the international cooperation critical to reducing the risks of nuclear war, climate change, the misuse of biotechnology, the potential threat of artificial intelligence, and other apocalyptic dangers. Those are not the words of activists or alarmists. They are the words of people who study existential risk for a living, people who understand probability and consequence at scales most of us cannot imagine. The clock moved forward 1 second in 2025. It moved forward 4 more seconds in 2026. Each adjustment represents not a single event, but a trajectory, a direction, a slope that tilts toward disaster unless something changes. Consider the progression. In 2020, the clock stood at 100 seconds to midnight. That was already the closest it had ever been. 100 seconds, less than 2 minutes between humanity and theoretical annihilation. Then came the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, the acceleration of climate impacts, the explosion of artificial intelligence capabilities. In 2023, the clock moved to 90 seconds. In 2025, 89 seconds, and now 85. Each second represents not time as we experience it in daily life. Each second represents an erosion of safety margins, a fraying of the systems that keep weapons contained, a weakening of the institutions that enable nations to cooperate instead of compete for survival. Daniel Holtz is a professor of physics at the University of Chicago and chair of the Bulletin Science and Security Board. On the morning of the announcement, he stood beside Bell and explained what the scientists had observed over the previous year. In terms of nuclear risks, nothing in 2025 trended in the right direction, he said. Nothing, not a single positive development in the domain that remains humanity's most immediate existential threat, the weapons that could end civilization in an afternoon. But Holtz did not stop there. He spoke about climate, about how atmospheric carbon dioxide and global sea levels have reached record highs, about how droughts, fires, floods, and storms continue to intensify and become more erratic. And this will only get worse, he said. He spoke about artificial intelligence, about how AI is a significant and accelerating disruptive technology, about how it is supercharging misinformation and disinformation, making it even more difficult to address all the other threats the scientists consider. And he spoke about biology, about how new tools, including AI itself, are creating capabilities that did not exist even 5 years ago. Capabilities to design pathogens, to engineer organisms, to create forms of life that have never existed in nature and might prove impossible to contain. The woman in the audience who asked the first question wanted to know something specific. She wanted to know what ordinary people should do with this information. Bell paused before answering. The problems the world faces can feel overwhelming, she said, but they are human-made and they are still solvable. That is the essential tension at the heart of the Doomsday Clock. It is a warning, not a prophecy. It tells us we are in danger. It does not tell us we are doomed. The scientists who set the clock believe fundamentally that human beings have the capacity to change course. They believe that the same intelligence that created nuclear weapons can create treaties to limit them. The same ingenuity that developed fossil fuels can develop clean energy. The same scientific enterprise that is pushing the boundaries of artificial intelligence can establish guardrails to ensure it serves humanity rather than threatening it. But belief in human capacity is not the same as confidence in human choice. The clock does not measure what we can do. It measures what we are doing. And right now, according to the people who study these questions most carefully, what we are doing is not enough. The announcement in January 2026 was not a surprise to those who follow these developments. For years, the warning signs have been accumulating. The New START Treaty, the last remaining agreement limiting American and Russian nuclear arsenals, expires in February 2026, less than a month after the clock announcement, and there are no negotiations to replace it. No serious discussions about extending it, nothing. Russia suspended its participation in the treaty in 2023. The verification measures that allowed each side to confirm the other was keeping its commitments have been on hold for years. The trust that made arms control possible has eroded almost completely. Meanwhile, China is expanding its nuclear arsenal faster than any country in history, adding roughly 100 warheads per year, building new missile silos in the desert, developing capabilities that will give it strategic power with the United States and Russia within the decade. India and Pakistan continue their nuclear competition. North Korea tests missiles and threatens its neighbors. Israel, which has never officially acknowledged its nuclear arsenal, appears to be modernizing weapons it claims not to possess. The architecture of nuclear restraint that was built painstakingly over decades is collapsing, and no one is building anything to replace it. This is what the scientists mean when they talk about a failure of leadership. Not the absence of good intentions, not the lack of technical solutions, but the unwillingness of those in power to prioritize long-term survival over short-term advantage. The choice made again and again to compete rather than cooperate, to arm rather than disarm, to divide rather than unite. The nuclear threat would be enough by itself to justify the movement of the clock, but it is not alone. Layer on top of it the climate crisis, a planet that has already warmed more than 1.3 degrees C above pre-industrial levels, a planet where coral reefs are dying en masse, where ice sheets are destabilizing, where the Amazon rainforest is approaching a tipping point beyond which it could transform from the lungs of the Earth into a source of carbon emissions. The scientists note that 2024 was the hottest year in recorded history, that extreme weather events are becoming more frequent and more severe, that the promises made at international climate conferences are not being kept. The policies currently in place would lead to warming of roughly 2.5 degrees C by the end of the century, a level that would trigger multiple cascading tipping points. Rising seas, collapsing ecosystems, mass migration, food and water insecurity on a scale that could destabilize nations and regions. And even that understates the risk, because climate models are based on gradual change, on smooth curves that rise predictably over time. But the climate system does not work that way. It contains thresholds, points of no return, moments when a small additional push triggers a large and irreversible shift. The death of warm water coral reefs may be the first such threshold we have crossed. Scientists now believe that even if warming is reversed, many of these reefs will not recover. They're gone. And with them, the ecosystems that support hundreds of millions of people who depend on reef fisheries for food and livelihood. Other thresholds loom ahead. The collapse of the Atlantic Meridian overturning circulation. The current that carries warm water north and keeps Europe habitable. The disintegration of the West Antarctic ice sheet. A process that once begun cannot be stopped and would raise sea levels by several meters over centuries. The dieback of the Amazon, the thawing of permafrost that would release billions of tons of methane into the atmosphere, accelerating warming in a feedback loop beyond human control. The scientists at the Bulletin understand all of this. They incorporate it into their assessment, and they conclude that the world is not responding with the urgency the situation demands. Then there is artificial intelligence, a technology that has advanced more rapidly in the past 3 years than in the previous 30. Large language models that can generate text indistinguishable from human writing. Image generators that can create photorealistic pictures of events that never happened. Voice synthesizers that can clone anyone's speech from a few seconds of audio. These tools are already being used to spread disinformation, to create deep-fake videos of political figures, to manipulate elections, to sow confusion and erode trust in institutions. The bulletin notes that AI is supercharging these threats, making it cheaper and easier to lie at scale, making it harder for citizens to distinguish truth from fabrication. But the information threat is only part of the concern. AI is also being integrated into military systems. Lethal autonomous weapons, drones that can identify and engage targets without human intervention. Systems that can make life and death decisions faster than any human could review or override. In December 2024, the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution on lethal autonomous weapons systems. 166 countries voted in favor, 3 opposed: Russia, North Korea, and Belarus. 15 abstained, including Ukraine. The resolution called for regulation, for human control over the use of force, for limits on the integration of AI into weapons that could kill without human judgment. But a resolution is not a treaty. It has no enforcement mechanism. And the countries developing these weapons most aggressively showed little interest in restraint. The scientists warn that an AI arms race is underway, that the major powers are competing to develop autonomous systems without adequate safeguards, that the pressure to deploy these technologies before they are properly understood or controlled could lead to catastrophic failures, accidents, misuse, escalation. And then there is the threat that may be least familiar, but is perhaps most disturbing: the possibility of synthetic mirror life. In December 2024, 38 scientists, including 2 Nobel laureates, published a warning in the journal Science. They described research that could within the next decade or 2 enable the creation of mirror bacteria, organisms built from molecules that are the reverse of those found in all natural life. The concern is not theoretical. It is based on an understanding of biology at the molecular level. All life on Earth uses the same handedness of molecules: left-handed amino acids to build proteins, right-handed sugars in DNA and RNA. This consistency is fundamental to how life works. Enzymes recognize their targets by shape. Immune systems identify threats by molecular structure. Predators digest prey because they share the same basic chemistry. Mirror life would be different. It would use right-handed amino acids and left-handed sugars. It would be invisible to immune systems, unrecognizable to enzymes, indigestible to predators. If mirror bacteria were created and escaped containment, they could spread through ecosystems without any natural check. They could cause infections that no antibiotic could treat. They could consume resources that other organisms depend on. They could, in the worst case, trigger a cascade of ecological collapse that would threaten all complex life on Earth. The scientists who signed the warning called for mirror organisms never to be created. They argued that the risks far outweigh any potential benefits. They pointed out that the enabling technologies are advancing rapidly, that without deliberate international action to prevent it, someone somewhere will attempt to build mirror life within our lifetimes. The bulletin incorporated this warning into its 2026 assessment. It cited mirror biology as one of 4 developments that increase the risk of biological catastrophe, along with AI tools that can help design biological threats, state-sponsored biological weapons programs, and the dismantling of public health infrastructure in the 4 biological threats layered on top of nuclear threats, climate threats, AI threats, all converging at once, all accelerating, all demanding responses that are not coming. 85 seconds to midnight. The number is symbolic. It does not mean we have 85 seconds left. It means the scientists who study these questions most carefully have concluded that the combined weight of existential risk has never been greater, that the trajectory we are on leads toward catastrophe unless something changes. The clock has moved backward before. In 1991, after the Cold War ended and the United States and the Soviet Union signed the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, the clock stood at 17 minutes to midnight, the farthest it has ever been from disaster. That was a moment of hope, a moment when it seemed possible that humanity might step back from the edge, might choose cooperation over competition, might build institutions strong enough to manage the most dangerous technologies ever created. That hope has not been extinguished, but it is flickering, and the clock is closer to midnight than it has ever been. In the chapters ahead, we will examine each of these threats in detail. We will trace their origins, understand their mechanisms, assess their trajectories, and explore what, if anything, can be done to change course. But first, we need to understand where the clock came from, who created it, and why. Because the story of the Doomsday Clock is not just a story about symbols and warnings. It is a story about conscience, about scientists who helped build the most destructive weapon in human history and then spent the rest of their lives trying to ensure it would never be used. Their story begins in a different time, a time of war and fear and terrible choices. A time when the fate of civilization rested on the decisions of a few, a time not unlike our own. Chapter 2, Born from the Ashes of Hiroshima. The men who built the first atomic bomb knew what they were creating. They understood the physics. They calculated the yields. They estimated the casualties, and many of them hoped, even as they worked to complete the weapon, that it would never be used. The story of the Doomsday Clock begins not in 1947, when the clock first appeared, but in 1945, in the deserts of New Mexico, in the laboratories of Chicago, in the minds of scientists who realized that they had opened it till that could never be closed. The Manhattan Project was the largest scientific undertaking in human history up to that point. At its peak, it employed more than 120,000 people across dozens of sites. Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Hanford, Washington, Los Alamos, New Mexico, and the Metallurgical Laboratory at the University of Chicago, where in December 1942, Enrico Fermi achieved the first controlled nuclear chain reaction beneath the stands of an unused football stadium. The scientists who worked on the project were driven by fear. Fear that Nazi Germany was pursuing an atomic bomb. Fear that if Hitler obtained such a weapon first, nothing could stop him. Albert Einstein, a pacifist by conviction, had signed a letter to President Franklin Roosevelt in 1939 warning of the possibility of extremely powerful bombs of a new type. That letter helped launch the American program. But Germany surrendered in May 1945. Before the bomb was ready, the scientists faced a new question. Should the weapon be used against Japan, or should there be a demonstration, a warning, an opportunity for surrender before cities were destroyed? In June 1945, a group of scientists at the University of Chicago formed a committee to study the question. They called themselves the Committee on Social and Political Implications. The committee was chaired by James Franck, a Nobel laureate in physics, but the principal author of their report was Eugene Rabinowitch, a biophysicist who had worked on the project and understood its implications. The Franck report, as it came to be known, argued against using the bomb on a civilian population without warning. The report was delivered to Secretary of War Henry Stimson on June 11, 1945. It warned that a surprise attack would severely damage the moral position of the United States, that it would trigger a nuclear arms race, that the short-term military advantage would be outweighed by the long-term political and ethical costs. The report was ignored, or rather, it was considered and rejected. Stimson convened an interim committee that recommended using the bomb on a dual target, a military installation surrounded by civilian housing to maximize the psychological impact. The scientists who had raised objections were overruled by military and political considerations. On July 16, 1945, the first atomic device was detonated at the Trinity Test site in New Mexico. The blast was visible for 200 m. The mushroom cloud rose 40,000 ft. A man-made sun had appeared in the desert. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the scientific director of Los Alamos, later said he thought of a line from Hindu scripture. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." 3 weeks later, on August 6th, a B-29 bomber named the Enola Gay dropped a uranium bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The blast killed approximately 80,000 people instantly. Tens of thousands more died in the following weeks and months from burns, radiation sickness, and injuries. The city center was obliterated. A thriving metropolis reduced to ash and rubble in a single flash of light. 3 days later, a second bomb, this one using plutonium, was dropped on Nagasaki. Another 40,000 dead immediately. Another city destroyed. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. World War II was over. The atomic age had begun. The scientists who had built the bomb faced a reckoning. Some felt justified. They had helped end the war. They had saved the lives of American soldiers who would have died in an invasion of Japan. They had demonstrated a weapon so terrible that perhaps they hoped no one would ever use nuclear weapons again. Others felt something closer to horror. They had created a weapon of indiscriminate destruction, a weapon that killed civilians by the tens of thousands, weapon that opened the door to an arms race that could end human civilization. Leo Szilard was one of the most troubled, a Hungarian physicist who had first conceived the possibility of a nuclear chain reaction in 1933. Szilard had helped draft the Einstein letter that launched the American program. He had worked on the reactor at Chicago, and he had tried repeatedly and unsuccessfully to prevent the bomb from being used on cities. In July 1945, Szilard had circulated a petition among scientists at the Manhattan Project urging the president to demonstrate the bomb rather than use it on a populated area. 69 scientists signed. The petition never reached Truman. It was classified and suppressed. When Szilard learned that the bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima, he called it one of the greatest blunders of history. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, what was coming next. The Soviet Union would develop its own bomb. Other nations would follow. The world would live under the shadow of annihilation. In the weeks after the Japanese surrender, the scientists at the metallurgical laboratory in Chicago gathered to discuss what they should do. They had unique knowledge. They understood what nuclear weapons could do. They understood that more powerful weapons were possible. Hydrogen bombs that would dwarf the Hiroshima and Nagasaki devices. Arsenals that could destroy civilization multiple times over. They decided they had a responsibility to inform the public, to shape policy, to prevent, if possible, the nightmare they could see approaching. In September 1945, approximately 200 scientists at the Chicago laboratory reorganized as the Atomic Scientists of Chicago. They began publishing a newsletter, a simple mimeograph bulletin distributed to colleagues and journalists. The name was straightforward, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. Eugene Rabinowitz, who had written the Frank Report, became the editor. He would hold that position for nearly 30 years until his death in 1973. The Bulletin's mission was clear from the beginning: to explore, clarify, and formulate the opinion and responsibilities of scientists in regard to the problems brought about by the release of nuclear energy, and to educate the public to a full understanding of the scientific, technological, and social problems arising from that release. The first issue appeared on December 10, 1945, 4 months after Hiroshima. The newsletter was 6 pages long. It dealt with technical matters, legislation, international control of atomic energy. But beneath the policy discussions was an urgent moral message. The scientists who had built the bomb believed it was their duty to warn the world about what they had created. For the first time in modern history, Rabinowitz later wrote, scientists were saying that it was necessary to make judgments about what to do with their inventions. The atomic scientists had crossed a threshold. They could not retreat into the laboratory and pretend their work had no consequences. They had helped create the potential for human extinction. Now they had to help prevent it. The bulletin's message was distilled into 3 phrases. No secret, international control. No secret meant that the American monopoly on atomic weapons could not last. Other nations would develop the technology. The physics was well understood. The engineering was difficult but not impossible. Within years, not decades, there would be multiple nuclear powers. No defense meant that there was no practical way to protect against nuclear attack. No shield, no interceptor, no early warning system that could prevent a determined adversary from from destroying a city. The only real defense was to prevent the attack from happening in the first place. International control meant that the only way to prevent a nuclear arms race was through international agreements, treaties, inspections, shared management of nuclear technology. The scientists hoped that the horror of Hiroshima would inspire a new era of cooperation, that nations would choose survival over sovereignty. They were partly right and partly wrong. The American monopoly did not last. The Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb in August 1949, 4 years after Hiroshima. Britain followed in 1952, France in 1960, China in 1964. The club kept growing, but international control never arrived, not in the form the scientists had hoped. There were treaties, test bans, non-proliferation agreements, arms limitation agreements, but there was never a comprehensive system to prevent nuclear weapons from spreading or to eliminate them entirely. The arms race the scientists had predicted came to pass. At its peak in the mid-1980s, the combined arsenals of the United States and the Soviet Union contained more than 70,000 nuclear weapons, enough to destroy civilization many times over. The Bulletin continued publishing through all of this. It became a magazine, it attracted subscribers, it won awards, but its most powerful communication was not an article or an editorial, it was an image. In 1947, the Bulletin was transitioning from a newsletter to a magazine format. The editors wanted a cover that would capture the urgency of their message. Something visual, something memorable, something that would convey the danger in a single glance. Hyman Goldsmith, one of the founders, asked an artist named Mart Langdorf to design the cover. Langdorf was a landscape painter. She was also the wife of Alexander Langdorf, a physicist who had worked on the Manhattan Project and signed the Szilard petition. Martel, as she was known professionally, first considered using the symbol for uranium, but she felt it was too abstract, too technical. It would not communicate to ordinary people the nature of the threat. Then she thought of a clock approaching midnight. Midnight as a symbol of catastrophe, the end of the world, or the end of civilization as we know it. She placed the clock face in the upper left corner of the cover. The minute hand pointed to 7 minutes before midnight. She did not include the bottom half of the clock, only the top left quadrant, the section that mattered, the approach to 12. Why 7 minutes? According to Martel, she chose it largely because it looked right aesthetically. The position was arbitrary. What mattered was the symbolism. Humanity was running out of time. The Doomsday Clock first appeared on the cover of the June 1947 issue of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. It has appeared on every cover since, and over the decades, its minute hand has moved backward when prospects improved, forward when they worsened. In 1949, when the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb, the clock moved from 7 minutes to 3 minutes to midnight. The arms race had begun. In 1953, after both the United States and the Soviet Union tested hydrogen bombs, devices hundreds of times more powerful than the Hiroshima weapon, the clock moved to 2 minutes to midnight, the closest it would come for decades. The hydrogen bomb was the nightmare the scientists had feared. The atomic bombs dropped on Japan used fission, splitting heavy atoms to release energy. Hydrogen bombs use fusion, combining light atoms to release even more energy. A fission bomb is used as a trigger to ignite the fusion reaction. The result is a weapon with almost no upper limit on its destructive power. The first American hydrogen bomb test in November 1952 vaporized an entire island. The fireball was 3 m wide. The mushroom cloud rose into the stratosphere. The yield was more than 400 times the Hiroshima bomb. Within months, the Soviets had their own hydrogen bomb. The arms race accelerated. Each side built more weapons, bigger weapons, faster delivery systems. Bombers gave way to missiles. Missiles became intercontinental. Warning time shrank from hours to minutes. The scientists at the Bulletin watched all of this with growing alarm. They had hoped that the horror of nuclear weapons would inspire restraint. Instead, it seemed to inspire an arms buildup without precedent in human history. But the clock did not only move forward. In 1960, after the United States and the Soviet Union began negotiating arms control agreements, the clock moved back to 7 minutes to midnight. In 1963, after the Partial Test Ban Treaty prohibited nuclear tests in the atmosphere, underwater, and in space, the clock moved to 12 minutes. The clock's movements reflected not just the quantity of weapons, but the quality of relations between nuclear powers. When leaders talked, when treaties were signed, when inspections were agreed to, the clock moved backward. When negotiations collapsed, when weapons were tested, when rhetoric turned hostile, the clock moved forward. The furthest the clock has ever been from midnight was in 1991, 17 minutes. The Cold War had ended. The Soviet Union had dissolved. The United States and Russia signed the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, the first agreement requiring deep cuts to nuclear arsenals. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that the nightmare was ending, that the weapons would be dismantled, that the existential threat might recede. That hope did not last. The clock began moving forward again, slowly at first, then faster. In 2007, the Bulletin's Board of Directors made a significant change. They decided that nuclear weapons were no longer the only existential threat. Climate change, they concluded, posed a comparable danger to human civilization. From that point forward, the clock would reflect both nuclear and climate risks. The decision was controversial. Some argued that mixing nuclear and climate threats diluted the clock's message, that the urgency of nuclear danger was different in kind from the slower accumulation of climate risk. But the scientists argued that both threatened human civilization, both required immediate action, both were being ignored by political leaders. The clock continued moving forward, 100 seconds in 2020, 90 seconds in 2023, 89 seconds in 2025, and now in 2026, 85 seconds. The scientists who created the Doomsday Clock are almost all gone now. Rabinowitz died in 1973, Szilard in 1964. The generation that built the bomb and then dedicated their lives to preventing its use has passed, but the institution they created endures. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist still publishes. The Science and Security Board still meets. The clock still appears on the cover of every issue, and every January, the board announces whether the clock has moved. The announcement has become a ritual, a moment when the world pauses to consider where it stands, how close to disaster, how far from safety. The symbolism is powerful precisely because it is simple. Everyone understands a clock. Everyone knows what midnight means. The creators of the clock never intended it to predict the future. They intended it to change the future, to warn, to motivate, to focus attention on dangers that might otherwise be ignored. In 1947, the danger was clear. Nuclear weapons existed. They had been used. They would spread. The question was whether humanity would learn to live with them without dying from them. In 2026, the dangers have multiplied. Nuclear weapons remain. Climate change has arrived. Artificial intelligence is accelerating. Biological threats, both natural and engineered, are proliferating. And in the shadows, new forms of synthetic life that could challenge the very foundations of the biosphere. The scientists who set the clock today are the intellectual heirs of those who created it. They carry the same burden. The knowledge that human ingenuity has created the means of human extinction and the conviction that human wisdom can still prevent it. But wisdom requires action, and action requires awareness. And awareness requires symbols that cut through the noise and distraction of daily life. Symbols like a clock counting down. Toward midnight, 85 seconds. The clock is ticking. And in the next chapter, we will examine the threat that has haunted humanity longest, the threat that inspired the clock's creation, the shadow that has hung over every generation since Hiroshima. The nuclear shadow is returning. Chapter 3. The nuclear shadow returns. Picture a world without guardrails, a world where the agreements that have limited nuclear weapons for decades simply expire, where the verification systems that allowed rivals to trust each other go dark. Where the arsenals that shrank after the Cold War begin to grow again, that world is not hypothetical, it is arriving. In February 2026, less than 2 weeks after the Doomsday Clock announcement, the New START treaty expires and there is nothing to replace it. New START is the last remaining agreement limiting American and Russian nuclear forces. It was signed in 2010 by President Barack Obama and President Dmitry Medvedev. It capped deployed strategic nuclear warheads at 1550 for each side. It established verification measures, inspections, data exchanges. The machinery that allows each country to confirm the other is keeping its commitments. For 15 years, that machinery has worked imperfectly with tensions and accusations, but it has worked. Both sides have stayed within the limits. Both sides have allowed inspections. Both sides have exchanged information. Now it is ending. Russia suspended its participation in New START in February 2023. It cited American support for Ukraine as the reason. The inspections stopped. The data exchanges stopped. The mechanisms that built confidence between nuclear rivals went silent. The treaty remained technically in force. Both sides claimed to be observing the numerical limits, but without verification, those claims became matters of faith rather than fact. And faith is a fragile foundation for nuclear stability. In 2025 and 2026, there were discussions, diplomatic feelers, suggestions that the treaty might be extended or replaced. President Putin expressed interest in talking. President Trump said he was open to negotiations, but interest and openness did not translate into action. The deadlines passed, the opportunities closed. On February 5, 2026, New START expires. After that date, there will be no legal limits on American or Russian nuclear forces. For the first time since 1972, when the first Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty was signed, the two largest nuclear arsenals in the world will be unconstrained by any agreement. This is what the scientists at the Bulletin meant when they said nothing in 2025 trended in the right direction on nuclear risks. To understand the danger, you have to understand the numbers. The United States has approximately 3,700 nuclear warheads in its stockpile. About 1,500 of those are deployed on strategic delivery systems, intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, strategic bombers. The rest are in reserve, available for upload if needed. Russia has similar numbers, slightly more warheads in total, slightly more deployed. The two countries together possess roughly 90% of the world's nuclear weapons. Both countries are modernizing their arsenals, not just maintaining them. Actively upgrading them, building new weapons, new delivery systems, new capabilities. The United States is in the middle of a comprehensive nuclear modernization program, new intercontinental ballistic missiles called Sentinel to replace the aging Minuteman III, new Columbia-class submarines to replace the Ohio-class boats, new B-21 Raider bombers, new air-launched cruise missiles, new submarine-launched cruise missiles, refurbishment of warheads, expansion of plutonium pit production facilities. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that operating and modernizing American nuclear forces will cost more than $95 billion per year. Over the next 3 decades, the total could exceed $2 trillion. Russia is modernizing too, developing new weapons that Putin has described as invincible. The Sarmat heavy ICBM, the Avangard hypersonic glide vehicle, the Poseidon nuclear-powered underwater drone, the Burevestnik nuclear-powered cruise missile weapons designed, Moscow says, to defeat American missile defenses. In December 2024, Russia released video of what it said was the deployment of the Orshnik hypersonic missile in Belarus, a weapon capable of striking targets across Europe with minimal warning time. And then there is China. For decades, China maintained a relatively small nuclear arsenal, a few hundred warheads, a posture based on minimum deterrence, enough weapons to ensure that any attacker would suffer unacceptable retaliation, but not enough to threaten a first strike capability. That is changing rapidly. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, China is expanding its nuclear arsenal faster than any other country, adding approximately 100 new warheads per year. By January 2025, China had completed, or was nearing completion, of approximately 350 new ICBM silos in 3 large desert fields in the north of the country and 3 mountainous areas in the east. The numbers are striking. In 2020, China was estimated to have around 300 nuclear warheads. By 2035, it could have 1,500 par with the United States and Russia. Some analysts argue this is a natural response to perceived threats. China sees American missile defenses, American forward-deployed forces in Asia, American alliances with Japan, South Korea, and Australia. Beijing may have concluded that a larger arsenal is necessary to ensure its deterrent remains credible. Others see something more aggressive, a bid for nuclear superpower status, a challenge to the American-led international order. A signal that China intends to be a peer competitor in every dimension of military power. Whatever the motivation, the consequences are real. For the first time, the United States faces the prospect of 2 near-peer nuclear adversaries simultaneously. Russia with its existing arsenal, China with its rapidly expanding one. The 2022 Congressional Commission on the Strategic Posture of the United States, a bipartisan body, concluded that American defense strategy requires a nuclear force that is either larger in size, different in composition, or both to address the 2 nuclear peer threat. The Commission called for urgent decisions to meet evolving deterrence requirements. This is the language of arms racing, not arms control, the logic of competition, not cooperation. Some members of Congress are already calling for significant expansion of American nuclear forces, uploading more warheads onto existing missiles, building additional submarines, developing new weapons systems, expanding production capacity. The estimated cost would be hundreds of billions of dollars. The result would be an acceleration of the global nuclear buildup, and the risks would multiply. Because nuclear weapons are not just numbers, they are systems, complex integrated fallible systems, systems that can fail, systems that can be misunderstood, systems that can be triggered by accident or miscalculation. During the Cold War, there were multiple incidents that nearly led to nuclear war. Radar systems mistaking flocks of geese for incoming missiles, computer errors generating false warnings of attack, communication failures during crisis. Each time disaster was averted by human judgment, by officers who chose not to launch, by leaders who hesitated when the machines screamed. The more weapons there are, the more systems there are. The more systems there are, the more opportunities for error. The more opportunities for error, the higher the probability that someday, somewhere, someone will make a mistake that cannot be corrected. And the warning times are shrinking. Hypersonic weapons travel faster than traditional ballistic missiles. They follow unpredictable trajectories. They are harder to track and harder to intercept. The time between detection and impact is measured in minutes. Daniel Holtz, the chair of the Bulletin Science and Security Board, spoke about this at the 2026 announcement. The combination of strikes on nuclear-related military infrastructure and third-party disinformation risk turning a conventional conflict into a nuclear crisis, he said, referring to tensions between India and Pakistan in early 2025. Think about that. Third-party disinformation, false information spread deliberately to confuse decision-makers, to make them believe they are under attack when they are not, or that they are safe when they are not. In a world of deepfakes and AI-generated content, the fog of war becomes denser. The clarity that leaders need in moments of crisis becomes harder to achieve. The time for deliberation shrinks. The pressure to act grows and the nuclear arsenals wait. Thousands of warheads, hundreds of missiles, many on hair-trigger alert, ready to launch within minutes of an order. The scientists who created the Doomsday Clock understood this dynamic. They knew that the existence of nuclear weapons creates an inherent instability, a situation where the rational response to perceived threat is preemption. where waiting could mean losing, where the incentive to strike first is built into the logic of deterrence. They hoped that international agreements could reduce this instability, that arms control could lower the numbers, increase the warning times, build the confidence that allows rivals to step back from the brink. For decades, those agreements worked imperfectly, incompletely, but they worked. The arsenal shrank. The systems of verification expanded. The conversations between nuclear powers continued even when relations were hostile. Now those agreements are collapsing. New START expires in February 2026. The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which banned American and Russian ground-launched missiles, with ranges between 500 and 5,500 km, ended in 2019. The Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which limited missile defenses, ended in 2002. The architecture of restraint is crumbling and nothing is being built to replace it. In July 2025, President Trump reportedly expressed interest in maintaining New START limits even after the treaty expired. In September, President Putin said Russia would continue to observe the limits if the United States did. These were positive signals, but signals are not agreements, and agreements require verification. Without inspections, without data exchanges, without the machinery of confirmation, limits become aspirations, hopes, not constraints. The Bulletin statement in 2026 was blunt. In regard to nuclear risk, Russia, China, the United States, and other major countries have instead become increasingly aggressive, adversarial, and nationalistic. Hard-won global understandings are collapsing. The phrase hard-won is important. Nuclear arms control did not happen easily. It took decades of negotiation, moments of crisis that concentrated minds, compromises that required leaders to accept limits on their own power. Each agreement was a small victory over the logic of arms racing, a small step back from the edge. Those victories are being reversed one by one, treaty by treaty. The ground that was gained over 50 years is being lost in a decade, and the consequences extend beyond the United States and Russia. Other nuclear states are watching. India, Pakistan, North Korea, Israel. If the great powers abandon restraint, what signal does that send to smaller nuclear states? What incentive do they have to limit their own arsenals? India and Pakistan nearly came to blows in 2025. The conflict was conventional, but both countries have nuclear weapons. Both have delivery systems capable of reaching the other cities. The escalation ladder extends upward into darkness. North Korea continues to develop its nuclear and missile capabilities. It has conducted multiple tests. It has threatened its neighbors. It remains outside any arms control framework. Israel, which has never officially acknowledged its nuclear arsenal, appears to be modernizing weapons it claims not to possess. Satellite imagery shows activity at the Dimona reactor site, test launches of missile systems. The ambiguity that has long characterized Israeli nuclear policy may be evolving into something more explicit. The nuclear club is not shrinking, it is expanding, and the rules that govern nuclear behavior for decades are weakening. This is the first of the existential threats that pushed the Doomsday Clock to 85 seconds. The threat that has been with us longest, the threat the clock was created to warn about. Nuclear weapons have not been used in conflict since Nagasaki, 78 years of restraint. Some call this the long peace, a testament to deterrence, proof that the weapons work, that the fear they inspire is sufficient to prevent their use. Others call it luck. 78 years of near misses and close calls, a series of accidents waiting to happen, a probability that accumulates over time until eventually it becomes certainty. The scientists at the Bulletin lean toward the second view. They do not believe that deterrence is stable. They do not believe that fear is a reliable foundation for peace. They believe that the longer nuclear weapons exist, the higher the probability they will be used. 85 seconds to midnight reflects that assessment. It reflects a world where the nuclear powers are competing rather than cooperating, where the treaties are expiring rather than multiplying, where the arsenals are growing rather than shrinking. It reflects a world where the nuclear shadow is returning. But nuclear weapons are not the only shadow. They are not even the newest. In the next chapter, we will examine a threat that did not exist when the Doomsday Clock was created. A threat that is evolving faster than any weapon system in history. The machines that choose who lives and who dies. Chapter 4. The machines that choose who lives. In 2020, a drone in Libya made a decision. A Turkish-made Cargo-2 loitering munition identified a target, calculated an approach, initiated an attack, and killed a human being. No operator pressed a button, no commander gave an order. The machine decided on its own. This was the first reported use of a fully autonomous lethal weapon in combat. The first time, as far as we know, that an artificial intelligence system independently chose to end a human life. The victim was a soldier fighting for forces loyal to Khalifa Haftar in the Libyan civil war. He may have been armed. He may have been a legitimate military target under the laws of war. We do not know. What we know is that a machine made the determination. A machine processed the data. A machine executed the strike. And no human pulled the trigger. This is the future that militaries around the world are racing toward. A future where decisions about life and death are delegated to algorithms, where machines identify targets, track movements, calculate probabilities, and engage without human intervention. The technology has a clinical name: Lethal Autonomous Weapon Systems, LAWS. The acronym itself seems designed to obscure what it describes: machines that kill autonomously, robots that hunt and destroy. The argument for these systems is efficiency. Machines react faster than humans. They do not hesitate. They do not flinch. They can process information from multiple sensors simultaneously. They can operate in environments too dangerous for human soldiers. They can stay on station for hours or days without fatigue. In military terms, they offer advantages: reduced casualties on your own side, faster decision cycles, the ability to overwhelm adversaries with swarms of coordinated platforms. Pentagon strategists call this a revolution in warfare. The argument against these systems is humanity. The laws of war require distinction. Combatants must be distinguished from civilians. They require proportionality. The harm caused by an attack must not be excessive relative to the military advantage gained. They require accountability. Someone must be responsible for the decision to use lethal force. Can a machine make these judgments? Can an algorithm distinguish a soldier from a farmer carrying a shovel? Can software determine whether a target in a civilian area justifies the risk of collateral damage? Can code be held accountable for a war crime? These are not hypothetical questions. They are urgent practical challenges. Because the technology is advancing faster than the law, faster than ethics, faster than our capacity to understand what we are creating. The Cargo-2 drone was just the beginning. Since 2020, autonomous capabilities have proliferated across battlefields around the world. In Ukraine, both sides have deployed drones with varying degrees of autonomy. Ukrainian forces have used AI-assisted targeting systems to locate and engage Russian positions. Russian forces have used similar technologies. The conflict has become, in some respects, a laboratory for autonomous warfare. The numbers are staggering. Ukraine produced approximately 2 million drones. The vast majority were domestically manufactured. Many incorporated AI for navigation, target recognition, and coordination with other drones. Drone swarms, multiple autonomous platforms operating together, sharing information, coordinating attacks, overwhelming defenses through sheer numbers. The technology is still in early stages, but military planners in every major power are investing heavily in its development. Israel has deployed autonomous systems in Gaza. The Harpy and Harop loitering munitions can identify radar emissions and attack autonomously. Reports have described AI systems assisting in target selection, processing intelligence at speeds no human analyst could match. Russia announced in 2025 that it would begin serial production of the Marilan robot, a ground-based platform capable of autonomous operation equipped with anti-tank missiles, and the ability to coordinate with drone swarms. China is pursuing what it calls military-civil fusion in artificial intelligence, a national strategy to ensure that advances in commercial AI are quickly integrated into military applications. The goal is technological supremacy. The means include autonomous weapons. The United States is not standing still. The Department of Defense has invested billions in autonomous systems. The Replicator initiative aims to deploy thousands of autonomous platforms within years. The Air Force is developing collaborative combat aircraft, unmanned systems that can fly alongside manned fighters, engaging targets with minimal human oversight. The Pentagon prefers the phrase human on the loop rather than human in the loop. The distinction is significant. Human in the loop means a person makes the decision to fire. Human on the loop means a person monitors the system but may not actively participate in each engagement. The machine decides, the human watches and perhaps intervenes. If there is time, time is the problem. In modern warfare, speed kills. The side that can process information faster, decide faster, act faster gains advantage. Adding human decision makers to the loop slows the process, creates vulnerabilities, opens windows for the adversary. The pressure to remove humans from critical decisions is immense. Not because military leaders want to abdicate responsibility, but because the logic of competition demands speed and machines are faster than people. This is what the scientists at the Bulletin mean when they talk about an AI arms race. Not just a competition to develop better algorithms, a competition to integrate AI into weapons at the highest possible level of autonomy. A race where the prize is military advantage and the cost may be human control over the use of lethal force. In December 2024, the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution on lethal autonomous weapon systems. The vote was 166 in favor, 3 opposed, Russia, North Korea, and Belarus. 15 abstained, including Ukraine. The resolution called for urgent action, for international guidelines, for human control over decisions to use force, for accountability mechanisms that ensure someone is responsible when things go wrong. But a resolution is not a treaty. It has no enforcement mechanism. It imposes no binding obligations. The countries developing autonomous weapons most aggressively showed little interest in meaningful restraint. Pope Francis called on world leaders to ban autonomous weapons. Machines should not decide whether humans live or die. He said even Patriarch Kirill of the Russian Orthodox Church, generally aligned with Kremlin policies, warned that the state should strictly control the development of AI in order to prevent the destruction of life and civilization. These appeals have had little effect on military planning. The development continues, the deployment accelerates, the human role in lethal decisions shrinks, and then there is the question of accidents. Autonomous systems can malfunction. They can misidentify targets. They can be spoofed by adversaries feeding false data. They can behave in ways their creators did not anticipate. During the Cold War, nuclear accidents were prevented by human judgment. Officers who questioned the data, commanders who waited for confirmation, people who chose not to launch even when their instruments screamed that missiles were incoming. What happens when the decision maker is not a person but a program? What happens when the system operates faster than human cognition? What happens when the algorithm concludes based on data it was designed to interpret that the correct response is lethal force? The scientists worry about cascading failures, autonomous systems on opposing sides, each reacting to the other's actions, escalation happening at machine speed, too fast for humans to intervene, too fast for diplomats to negotiate, too fast for anyone to say stop. This is not science fiction. It is the logical extrapolation of current trends. Systems are being developed now that are designed to operate with minimal human oversight. They are being deployed into environments where adversaries have similar systems. The interaction effects are unknown. The failure modes are unexplored. Daniel Holtz spoke about this at the Doomsday Clock announcement. AI is a significant and accelerating disruptive technology. He said it is also supercharging misinformation and disinformation, which makes it even more difficult to address all of the other threats we consider. The disinformation angle is critical. If that data can be corrupted, if false information can be injected, the system's decisions become unreliable. Imagine a scenario: two nations on the brink of conflict. Autonomous systems patrolling borders, monitoring airspace, ready to engage. Now imagine a third party, a state or non-state actor spoofing the sensor data, making it appear that one side has launched an attack. The autonomous systems respond. The humans operating at human speed cannot keep up. By the time they understand what has happened, the escalation is beyond control. This is the world the scientists see approaching. A world where the speed of technology outpaces the speed of human judgment, where the complexity of interconnected systems exceeds human comprehension, where the potential for catastrophic error grows with each new capability deployed. The bulletin does not call for an end to AI research. It does not oppose all military applications of autonomous systems. It calls for governance, guidelines, international cooperation to ensure that human control is maintained over decisions that could lead to war. Human in the loop, not just on the loop, meaningful human control, not nominal oversight. Accountability structures that can assign responsibility when things go wrong, and transparency about what these systems can do and how they are being used. These are modest demands, basic principles that most people would agree with if asked, yet progress toward implementing them has been minimal. The militaries developing autonomous weapons see them as sources of advantage. Agreeing to limits means giving up advantage, and in a competitive environment, no one wants to be second. The result is a race without rules, a competition where the stakes are not market share or prestige, but the ability to wage war. And the prize goes to whoever is willing to push furthest, fastest, regardless of the risks. The UN resolution called for urgent action, but urgency has not translated into action. The working groups meet, the discussions continue, and the weapons are deployed. This is one dimension of the AI threat to human survival. The integration of autonomous systems into military forces, the erosion of human control over lethal decisions, the acceleration of conflict dynamics to speeds that exceed human capacity to respond. But there is another dimension, equally dangerous, perhaps more insidious: the corruption of truth itself. Autonomous weapons can kill bodies, AI disinformation can kill minds. It can poison the information environment on which democratic societies depend. It can make it impossible to distinguish fact from fabrication. It can turn citizens against each other and leaders against their own judgment. This is the war on truth, and it is the subject of our next chapter, Chapter 5, The War on Truth. In January 2024, thousands of voters in New Hampshire received a phone call. The voice on the line was familiar. President Joe Biden telling Democrats not to vote in the upcoming primary. Save your vote for November. The voice said voting in the primary would only help the Republicans, except it was not Joe Biden. It was an AI-generated imitation, a deep-fake audio designed to suppress voter turnout. A fabrication so convincing that it took days to confirm it was false. The man who created the recall, a Democratic political consultant named Steve Kramer, later said he did it to raise awareness about the dangers of AI, to demonstrate how easily the technology could be misused. He was fined $6 million by the Federal Communications Commission and indicted on criminal charges. But the damage was done not because the fake calls changed the outcome of the primary. As far as anyone can tell, they did not. The damage was more fundamental. The calls demonstrated that the voice of a president could be forged, that audio testimony could no longer be trusted, that the foundation of evidence itself was crumbling. This is the war on truth, a conflict fought not with weapons but with words, not on battlefields but in information ecosystems, not for territory but for minds. And artificial intelligence has become its most powerful weapon. The technology that enables deepfakes has advanced with terrifying speed. In 2020, creating a convincing fake video required significant technical skill, expensive equipment, and hours of source material. In 2024, it can be done with consumer-grade software and a few seconds of audio. Large language models like ChatGPT can generate text that is indistinguishable from human writing. Image generators can create photorealistic pictures of events that never happened. Voice synthesizers can clone anyone's speech from a brief sample. Video tools can make anyone appear to say or do anything. The implications for truth are profound. For centuries, certain forms of evidence were considered reliable. Photographs captured reality, audio recordings preserved spoken words, video footage documented events. These forms of evidence could be manipulated, of course, but manipulation required effort, skill, time. It left traces. Experts could usually detect fraud. That is no longer true. AI-generated content can be created instantly at scale with no technical expertise required. And detecting it is becoming increasingly difficult as the technology improves. The result is what researchers call the liar's dividend. In a world where anything can be faked, anyone can deny anything. A video of a politician accepting a bribe, deepfake, audio of a CEO committing fraud, AI-generated, evidence of war crimes fabricated by enemies. When everything can be fake, nothing has to be real. The very concept of evidence dissolves. This is not a future problem. It is happening now across the world in elections, in conflicts, in courts, in families. 2024 was the largest election year in human history. 3.7 billion people in 72 countries had the opportunity to vote. And in election after election, AI-generated content appeared. In India, deepfakes showed celebrities criticizing Prime Minister Narendra Modi and endorsing opposition parties. The videos spread across WhatsApp and YouTube, viewed millions of times before they were debunked. In Brazil, deepfakes and bots spread false political narratives on social media platforms. In Slovakia, fake audio purporting to show a candidate discussing election manipulation went viral days before the vote. In Indonesia, AI-generated video showed the late dictator Suharto endorsing political candidates, the dead speaking for the living. In the United States, Donald Trump shared AI-generated images on social media showing Taylor Swift fans wearing pro-Trump merchandise. Kamala Harris appeared in AI-generated images depicting her in communist garb. A video linked to Russian intelligence services accused Harris of involvement in a hit-and-run accident. None of these were real. All of them reached millions of people. The scale of the problem is difficult to grasp. The News Literacy Project, which tracks misinformation about American elections, found that cheap fakes, traditional manipulated media, were used 7 times more often than AI-generated content. But AI is accelerating, the gap is closing, and the volume of both types is overwhelming human capacity to fact-check. The Brennan Center for Justice summarized the situation with precision. The long-term consequences of AI-driven disinformation go beyond eroding trust. They create a landscape where truth itself becomes contested. As deepfakes and manipulated content grow more sophisticated, bad actors can exploit the confusion, dismissing real evidence as fake and muddying public discourse. This is the liar's dividend in action. A world where powerful people can escape accountability by claiming that evidence against them is fabricated, where whistleblowers are dismissed as purveyors of deepfakes, where documentation loses its authority. The scientists at the Bulletin are explicit about this concern. AI is supercharging misinformation and disinformation, Daniel Holt said at the 2026 announcement. It makes it even more difficult to address all of the other threats we consider. This is a crucial point. The information ecosystem is not separate from other existential. It is the medium through which we understand and respond to those risks. If the information ecosystem is corrupted, our capacity to recognize and address dangers is diminished. Consider climate change. The scientific consensus is overwhelming. Human activities are warming the planet. The consequences are severe and accelerating. Action is urgent, but large segments of the public remain skeptical. Not because the evidence is unclear, but because the information environment is polluted. Fossil fuel companies have funded disinformation campaigns for decades. Social media algorithms amplify controversy and doubt. AI now enables the creation of false experts, fake studies, fabricated data at industrial scale. How do you build political will for climate action when a substantial portion of the electorate believes the threat is exaggerated or invented? How do you implement policies when every fact is contested, every expert is dismissed, every piece of evidence is labeled propaganda? Consider nuclear risk. Arms control depends on trust, verification, shared understanding of what each side possesses and intends. If that understanding can be corrupted, if false intelligence can be generated at scale, if leaders cannot distinguish genuine threats from fabrications, the margin for error shrinks to zero. Consider biological threats. Pandemic response depends on accurate information about pathogens, transmission, and effective interventions. If health information is polluted with false claims, if vaccines are wrongly demonized, if effective treatments are undermined by misinformation, the capacity to respond to biological threats collapses. AI-driven disinformation is not just a threat to democracy, it is a threat multiplier. It makes every other threat harder to address. It corrodes the shared reality on which collective action depends. And the tools for creating it are becoming more accessible every day. In the early days of the internet, optimists predicted a golden age of information. Universal access to knowledge, democratic participation unmediated by gatekeepers, the wisdom of crowds. Some of that vision has been realized, but so has its opposite. Universal access to misinformation, manipulation unrestrained by accountability, the madness of mobs. Social media platforms were designed to maximize engagement. The algorithm does not distinguish between true and false. It distinguishes between what keeps you scrolling and what makes you close the app. And it turns out that outrage, fear, and conflict keep people scrolling. Lies spread faster than truth on social media. Studies have documented this repeatedly. False claims travel further, reach more people, and persist longer than accurate corrections. The architecture of the platforms favors deception. Now add AI to that architecture. Systems that can generate unlimited content, that can target specific audiences with personalized lies, that can create thousands of fake accounts, each with a unique persona, each amplifying the same false narratives. The scale becomes inhuman, literally. No human organization could produce content at the rate AI systems enable. No human fact-checker could keep up. The asymmetry is overwhelming. Russia has pioneered the use of AI-enhanced disinformation. The Internet Research Agency, which interfered in the 2016 American election, has evolved. Its successors use language models to generate content, voice synthesis, to create audio and coordination algorithms to amplify messages across platforms. China has developed similar capabilities, so has Iran, so have domestic political actors in countries around the world. The line between foreign interference and domestic manipulation has blurred. The techniques are the same. The tools are commercially available. Anyone with resources and motivation can pollute the information environment of any country on Earth. And the platforms that carry this content have shown limited willingness or capacity to stop it. After the 2016 election, major platforms invested heavily in content moderation. They hired fact-checkers, developed detection algorithms, removed fake accounts, labeled misleading content. By 2024, many of those safeguards were being relaxed. Staff reductions at major platforms cut trust and safety teams. Policy changes reduced the scope of moderation, the commitment to fighting. Misinformation weakened even as the tools for creating it strengthened. At the Doomsday Clock announcement, the scientists noted the dismantling of public health infrastructure in the United States, as one factor increasing biological risk. The same dismantling is happening to information infrastructure. The systems designed to distinguish truth from falsehood are being dismantled, and the machines that generate falsehood are becoming more powerful. Where does this lead? Researchers describe several possible futures. In one, democratic societies adapt, media literacy improves. Verification tools become more sophisticated. Citizens develop healthy skepticism. Institutions learn to function in a post-trust environment. In another, societies fragment. Shared reality disappears. Each community believes its own version of events. Compromise becomes impossible because there is no common ground. Politics degenerates into tribal warfare. In a third, authoritarian systems flourish. They control information flows. They determine what is true. They eliminate the chaos of competing claims by imposing a single narrative. Freedom dies, but order survives. None of these futures is certain. All are possible. The path we take depends on choices made now. By governments, by platforms, by citizens. The scientists at the Bulletin do not claim to know which future will prevail. They know only that the current trajectory is dangerous, that the corruption of information makes every other challenge harder. That truth is infrastructure as essential to civilization as roads or water systems. And that infrastructure is under attack. 85 seconds to midnight reflects this reality. Not just the bomb, not just the climate, not just the machines, but the pollution of the information environment that connects everything else. In the next chapter, we turn to the physical world, to a planet whose climate is changing faster than anyone predicted, to tipping points that may have already been crossed, to cascading failures that could unravel the systems on which civilization depends. A Planet on Fire, Chapter 6, A Planet on Fire. In October 2025, 160 scientists from 23 countries released a report that should have stopped the world, the Global Tipping Points Report. 3 words that describe something civilization has never faced: the possibility that Earth's climate system is crossing thresholds beyond which change becomes irreversible. The report's conclusion was stark. Humanity has reached the first Earth system tipping point. The widespread death of warm water coral reefs, not approaching, not at risk, reached. The reefs that support 1/4 of all marine species, the reefs that protect coastlines from storms, the reefs that sustain the livelihoods of hundreds of millions of people, those reefs are dying. Not from a single event, but from a systemic collapse triggered by warming oceans, and they are just the beginning. To understand what a tipping point means, imagine a glass balanced on the edge of a table. You can push it slightly and it rocks back, push it a little more and it still recovers. But at some point, a threshold, a small additional push, sends it over the edge. The glass falls, it shatters, and no amount of effort can restore it to its original state. Climate tipping points work the same way. For decades, Earth systems have absorbed punishment: rising temperatures, acidifying oceans, deforestation, pollution. The systems bent but did not break. They continued functioning more or less as they always had. But they have limits, thresholds beyond which internal dynamics take over, where the system begins changing itself independent of what humans do, where feedback loops accelerate and intervention becomes impossible. The scientists identified multiple tipping points that could be triggered at relatively low levels of warming. Coral reefs, the Greenland ice sheet, the West Antarctic ice sheet, the Amazon rainforest, the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, permafrost in the Arctic. Each of these systems is showing signs of stress. Some may have already crossed their thresholds, and the consequences of crossing them range from severe to catastrophic. Consider the ice sheets. Greenland holds enough ice to raise global sea levels by 7 m if it melts completely. West Antarctica holds enough for 3 to 5 m. These are not overnight events. Complete melting would take centuries, but the process once started cannot be stopped. The Greenland ice sheet is already losing mass at an accelerating rate. It is now the largest contributor to global sea level rise. Scientists estimate that at temperatures between 8 and 3 degrees C above pre-industrial levels, the sheet will cross a threshold. Below that threshold, it might stabilize. Above it, the melting becomes self-sustaining. The ice darkens as it absorbs more heat. The surface lowers to warmer altitudes. The system feeds on itself. A 2021 analysis of sediment from beneath the Greenland ice found evidence that the sheet has melted completely at least once in the past million years. The maximum warming during that period was about 21/2 degrees C above pre-industrial levels. We are currently at about 13 degrees and rising. West Antarctica is even more precarious. Unlike Greenland, which sits on land above sea level, much of West Antarctica rests on bedrock below sea level. The ice is in contact with warming ocean water. As that water erodes the ice from beneath, the grounding line retreats. The ice that was held in place begins to flow faster toward the sea. Scientists call this marine ice sheet instability. Once it begins, it can accelerate rapidly. Some researchers believe parts of West Antarctica have already crossed their tipping point. The Thuit Glacier, sometimes called the Doomsday Glacier, is showing signs of accelerating collapse. The implications are measured in meters of sea level rise that would inundate coastal cities around the world. Miami, Shanghai, Mumbai, Lagos, London, New York, hundreds of millions of people displaced, trillions of dollars in infrastructure destroyed, entire nations submerged. This will not happen tomorrow. But the decisions made today determine whether it happens at all. If the ice sheets cross their tipping points, no future technology, no massive engineering project, no heroic intervention can stop the rise. The physics takes over. The ice falls into the sea and the sea rises. Then there is the Amazon, the largest rainforest on Earth, home to 10% of all species. A critical carbon sink that absorbs billions of tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. A giant pump that recycles moisture across South America, generating rainfall that sustains agriculture in cities far from the forest itself. The Amazon is approaching its limits. Deforestation has cleared vast areas. Climate change is altering rainfall patterns. Droughts are becoming more frequent and severe. Fires that were once rare are becoming common. Scientists estimate that if deforestation continues and temperatures rise, the Amazon could cross a threshold. The forest would begin dying from within. Trees would release more carbon than they absorb. The moisture pump would fail. The remaining forest would transition to savanna. This would not just be an ecological catastrophe, it would be a climate catastrophe. The carbon stored in Amazon trees released into the atmosphere would accelerate warming. The feedback loop would intensify. And then there is the circulation of the Atlantic Ocean, the Atlantic Meridian overturning circulation of Mach, a vast conveyor belt that carries warm water north from the tropics and cold water south along the ocean floor. It is what keeps Europe habitable. Without it, winters in London would resemble winters in Labrador. The AMOC is weakening. Fresh water from melting ice dilutes the salty water that sinks in the North Atlantic, slowing the circulation. Models suggest that at some level of warming, the AMOCC could collapse entirely. In October 2024, 44 climate scientists published an open letter warning that the risk of AMOCC collapse has been greatly underestimated. A study published in August 2025 concluded that collapse could begin as early as the 60s. If the AMOCC collapses, the consequences would cascade across the globe. European agriculture would be devastated. Monsoon patterns in Africa and Asia would shift. Food production would be disrupted for billions of people. The social and political instability would be immense. These tipping points are not isolated, they interact. Crossing one can increase the probability of crossing others. Ice sheet collapse raises sea levels, which can destabilize coastal permafrost. Amazon dieback releases carbon, which accelerates warming, which stresses other ecosystems. The scientists call this a tipping cascade, a domino effect where the fall of one system pushes others over the edge. The risk is not linear, it is exponential. And the further we push into the danger zone, the more unpredictable the consequences become. The Global Tipping Points report was released just weeks before the 30th United Nations Climate Conference, COP30, in Brazil. The timing was deliberate. The scientists wanted world leaders to understand what was at stake. The message was clear. The window for preventing some damaging, irreversible tipping points is rapidly closing. If we wait for certainty that tipping points have been crossed before we act, it will be too late. But the world has not acted. Not with the urgency the situation demands. The Paris Agreement signed in 2015 set a goal of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial levels. At the time, scientists believed this was the threshold below which the worst impacts could be avoided. That goal is now almost certainly out of reach. The planet has already warmed more than 1.3 degrees. Current policies, if fully implemented, would lead to warming of approximately 2.5 degrees by the end of the century, and current policies are not being fully implemented. 2024 was the hottest year in recorded history. So was 2023. So was 2022. The records are being broken faster than they can be set. The last 3 years have all approached or exceeded 1.5 degrees of warming. 2024 hit 1.55 degrees above pre-industrial levels. This does not mean the Paris skull has been permanently breached. Scientists measure long-term warming over 20-year averages to smooth out annual variations, but the trend is unmistakable. Carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere reached record highs in 2024. Methane concentrations reached record highs. The jump in atmospheric carbon dioxide in 2024 was the largest ever recorded, and nature is faltering. For decades, natural systems absorbed roughly half of human carbon emissions. Trees grew faster in a warming world. Oceans absorbed excess carbon dioxide. These natural sinks bought humanity time. That time may be running out. Recent data suggests the carbon sinks are weakening. Trees are dying from heat and drought. Oceans are becoming stratified, reducing their ability to absorb carbon. The planet is losing its capacity to buffer human impacts. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists incorporated climate change into its Doomsday Clock assessment in 2007. Since then, the clock has moved steadily closer to midnight. Climate change is not a separate threat from nuclear war or AI. It is interwoven with them. Climate instability drives conflict. Resource scarcity fuels competition. Desperate nations make desperate choices. The 2026 Doomsday Clock statement noted that national and international responses to climate change have ranged from wholly insufficient to profoundly destructive. It singled out American policy for particular criticism. President Trump has essentially declared war on renewable energy and sensible climate policies. The statement said relentlessly gutting national efforts to combat climate change. This is not about politics, it is about physics. Carbon dioxide traps heat, more carbon dioxide traps more heat, the planet warms, the consequences cascade. The physics does not care about elections, it does not negotiate. It does not respond to rhetoric or denial. It simply proceeds according to the laws of the scientists who study climate change are not alarmists. They are observers. They measure temperatures. They analyze ice cores. They model atmospheric dynamics. They track the movements of glaciers and the migrations of species. They report what they find, and what they find is terrifying. But the report also contained hope. Amid the warnings, the scientists noted positive developments. Solar and wind energy are growing faster than anyone predicted. Electric vehicle adoption is accelerating. Renewable and nuclear energy together surpassed 40% of global electricity generation for the first time in 2024. Once replaced, the report noted, polluting technologies are unlikely to come back. Cleaner options are cheaper and better. The path to safety still exists. It is narrow, it is closing, but it exists. The scientists believe that if humanity acts with sufficient speed and determination, the worst outcomes can still be avoided. Temperatures can be stabilized. Tipping points can be approached, but not crossed. The cascade can be prevented, but it requires action. not in decades. Now 85 seconds to midnight includes this assessment. It includes the ice sheets and the forests and the currents and the reefs. It includes the recognition that Earth systems have limits and that those limits are closer than we thought. In the next chapter, we will examine a threat that is different from all the others, not nuclear weapons or AI or climate change. Something stranger, something that exists for now only as a possibility, but a possibility that 38 scientists, including 2 Nobel laureates, have called an existential threat to all life on Earth. The mirror that could end everything. Chapter 7, The mirror that could end everything. The mirror that could end everything. In 1860, a French chemist named Louis Pasteur made a discovery that would reshape our understanding of life. He found that certain molecules come in 2 forms identical in composition, but mirror images of each other, like your left hand and your right hand, the same structure, but reversed. Pasteur called this propertiality from the Greek word for hand, and he wondered something profound. What if life itself could be built from mirror image molecules? What would such life look like? How would it interact with the world we know? For more than a century and a half, this remained a thought experiment, a curiosity for chemists to ponder. Mirror life was theoretically possible, but practically unachievable. The technology to create it did not exist. That is no longer true. In December 2024, 38 scientists published a warning in the journal Science. The authors included Nobel laureates, leaders in synthetic biology, experts in immunology, ecology, and biosecurity. Their message was stark. Mirror life, if created, could pose an unprecedented and irreversible threat to all life on Earth. To understand why, you need to understand how life works at the molecular level. All known life uses the same building blocks: amino acids that are left-handed, sugars that are right-handed. This consistency is not arbitrary. It is fundamental to how biological systems function. Enzymes recognize their targets by shape. Antibodies bind to pathogens based on molecular structure. Predators digest prey because they share the same basic chemistry. The entire machinery of life depends on this shared-handedness. Mirror life would be different. It would use right-handed amino acids and left-handed sugars, the mirror image of everything we know, and that is the problem. If mirror bacteria were created, they would be invisible to our immune systems. Antibodies are designed to recognize molecules with specific orientations. Mirror molecules would not fit the templates our defenses use. Infections caused by mirror organisms would trigger no immune response, no inflammation, no fever, no fighting back. They would be resistant to antibiotics. Most antibiotics work by interfering with bacterial processes that depend on normal molecular handedness. Against mirror bacteria, they would be useless. They would be indigestible to predators. The microorganisms that keep bacterial populations in check could not consume mirror bacteria. The normal ecological controls would not apply, and they could spread. Once released, mirror bacteria could replicate, evolve, adapt in an environment where nothing could eat them, nothing could kill them, nothing could stop them. They would have the entire biosphere as their territory. The scientists who published the warning described what could happen. Sufficiently robust mirror bacteria could spread through the environment unchecked by natural biological controls. The effects would extend to an unprecedentedly wide range of multicellular organisms, including humans. Think about what that means. Infections that cannot be treated. Ecological collapses, mirror organisms outcompete or displace natural life. Food chains disrupted. Ecosystems unraveled. A cascade of extinction that could threaten all complex life on Earth. This is not hyperbole. It is the considered judgment of experts who have spent their careers studying how life works. They are not prone to sensationalism. They understand probability and uncertainty, and they concluded that mirror organisms, even those with engineered biocontainment measures, should not be created. The concern is not that mirror life exists today. It does not. Creating a mirror bacterium would be extraordinarily difficult. It would require synthesizing from scratch all the molecular machinery of a cell, but in reverse. The proteins, the enzymes, the genetic material, the membrane, everything. No laboratory has achieved this. No laboratory is close to achieving it. The estimate is that mirror bacteria are at least a decade away, probably more, possibly much more. But the enabling technologies are advancing. Scientists can already synthesize mirror versions of individual molecules, mirror proteins, mirror DNA, mirror enzymes. In 2016, researchers created a mirror version of DNA polymerase, the enzyme that copies genetic material. In 2022, they created a mirror RNA polymerase. These are pieces of the puzzle, not the whole picture, but each piece brings the goal closer. Kate Adamala is a synthetic biologist at the University of Minnesota. She was one of the scientists who signed the warning. For years, she had worked on building synthetic cells from scratch. She had received a $4 million grant to investigate whether it was possible to create mirror cells. Then doubt crept in. It was never one light bulb moment. She said it was kind of a slow boiling over a few months. She began talking to colleagues in other fields, immunologists, ecologists, biosecurity experts, people who understood what it would mean if mirror organisms escaped containment. Their reactions alarmed her. People that are experts in biosafety, immunology, and ecology. They did not think that something like a mirror cell was actually likely. They thought it's science fiction. But when they realized it might actually be possible, they were deeply concerned. Adamala abandoned her research on mirror cells. She joined the effort to warn the scientific community and the public. She concluded that the pursuit of mirror life is not worth the risk. Not everyone agrees. Some researchers argue that mirror bacteria would be at a competitive disadvantage. They would struggle to find food in a world optimized for normal molecular handedness. They might not survive long outside the laboratory. Andrew Ellington, a molecular biologist at the University of Texas at Austin, is skeptical of the alarm. I would argue a mirror image bacteria would be at a gross competitive disadvantage and is not going to survive well, he said. He worries that raising concerns prematurely could stifle beneficial research. The debate continues, but the scientists who issued the warning have the weight of precaution on their side. They argue that the uncertainty itself is reason for restraint. We do not know exactly what would happen if mirror bacteria escaped. We cannot run the experiment in a controlled environment. The consequences could be irreversible. In the face of such uncertainty, they say the prudent course is not to proceed. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists incorporated this warning into its 2026 assessment. Mirror life was one of 4 developments cited as increasing the risk of biological catastrophe. The others were AI tools that can help design biological threats, state-sponsored biological weapons programs, and the dismantling of public health infrastructure. 4 biological threats, each distinct, each dangerous. Together, they represent a domain of risk that is growing faster than the world's capacity. The mirror life warning was included in the official Doomsday Clock statement. The scientists described it as a potentially existential threat to all life on Earth. They called for international action to prevent the creation of mirror organisms. Some progress has been made. In 2025, the UNESCO International Bioethics Committee recommended a precautionary global moratorium on the creation of mirror organisms. The UK Government Office for Science held an expert roundtable that recommended preventing the development of replicating mirror organisms. Germany's Central Commission for Biological Safety issued a statement that mirror bacteria could pose serious risks and called for broad scientific and societal debate. Several philanthropic funders have stated that they will not fund research with the goal of creating mirror organisms. The scientific community is engaging with the question. Lines are being drawn, but lines are not walls. The technology will continue to advance. The knowledge will continue to spread. Eventually, if no formal prohibition is established, someone somewhere will attempt to create mirror life for research, for profit, for prestige, or for reasons we cannot yet imagine. The scientists who signed the warning understand this. They are racing against time against the momentum of scientific progress, against the human drive to push boundaries, to explore the unknown, to create what has never existed. They're asking a question that science rarely asks. Not can we do this, but should we? Michael Kay is a biochemist at the University of Utah who has worked on Mira Pharmaceuticals for 20 years. His lab specializes in mirapeptides that could treat viruses. A mirapeptide HIV drug is in clinical trials. There are real benefits to Mira molecule research, but Kay drew a line. Mira bacteria, which would be living organisms capable of self-replicating, not just little bits of protein, are what Kay and his fellow scientists are concerned about. The distinction is crucial. Mira molecules created chemically and unable to reproduce pose none of the risks of Mira organisms. They can be used safely for research and therapy. The danger lies specifically in creating life that can replicate and spread. Timothy Hand is an immunologist at the University of Pittsburgh. He studies how immune systems respond to threats. When he considered what Mira bacteria would mean, his conclusion was unequivocal. Our immune systems have evolved over billions of years to recognize and respond to life as it exists. Mira life would be invisible to those systems. It would be like fighting a war where you cannot see the enemy, where you do not even know you are being attacked until it is too late. This is the nightmare scenario. Not a dramatic attack, not a visible catastrophe, a silent spreading, an invisible invasion, Mira organisms colonizing ecosystems while natural defenses stand helpless. By the time the damage became apparent, it might be irreversible. Jack Szostak is a Nobel laureate in chemistry. He was one of the 38 scientists who signed the warning. The consequences could be globally disastrous. He said globally disastrous from a Nobel laureate about a technology that does not yet exist, but is moving closer with each passing year. This is what the scientists at the Bulletin mean when they talk about emerging threats. Not just the familiar dangers of nuclear weapons and climate change. New possibilities created by advancing technology. Possibilities that did not exist a generation ago. Possibilities that could reshape or end life on Earth. 85 seconds to midnight includes Mira life. It includes the recognition that human ingenuity is outpacing human wisdom, that we're developing capabilities without understanding their consequences, that the margin for error is shrinking. The mirror that could end everything does not yet exist, but the reflection is becoming clearer. In the next chapter, we turn to biological threats that are more immediate, weapons programs that exist today, AI tools that are making bioweapons more accessible, and the erosion of the international agreements that have kept these threats contained. When biology becomes a weapon. Chapter 8. When biology becomes a weapon. In 1975, the world took a step back from one of its most terrifying possibilities. The Biological Weapons Convention entered into force. Nations agreed to prohibit the development, production, and stockpiling of biological weapons. They agreed to destroy existing arsenals. They committed, in the treaty's words, to never under any circumstances develop or acquire biological agents that have no justification for prophylactic, protective, or other peaceful purposes. It was a landmark achievement, the first international agreement to ban an entire category of weapons of mass destruction. By 2025, 187 nations had ratified the treaty. But the convention has a fatal flaw. It has no teeth. There is no verification mechanism, no inspection regime, no way to confirm that nations are keeping their promises. The treaty relies entirely on good faith, and good faith in the domain of weapons is a fragile foundation. In April 2024, the United States Department of State released a report on compliance with the convention. Its conclusions were alarming. North Korea maintains an active biological weapons program. Russia maintains an active biological weapons program. China has engaged in dual-use research that raises serious compliance concerns. Iran has conducted activities inconsistent with its treaty obligations. These are not allegations from activists or critics. They are the official assessments of the American government, assessments supported by intelligence from multiple agencies. Russia's biological weapons program has a long and dark history. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union operated the largest biological weapons program in human history. Tens of thousands of scientists worked at dozens of facilities. They weaponized anthrax, smallpox, plague, termia, and other pathogens. They developed delivery systems capable of spreading disease across continents. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia inherited this infrastructure. Moscow claimed to have dismantled the program. Western nations helped fund the conversion of facilities to civilian use. Scientists were offered employment in legitimate research, but doubts persisted. American and British intelligence continued to believe that Russia maintained covert biological weapons capability. The 2024 State Department report stated flatly that Russia has a current program. In April 2025, an updated report added a chilling detail. China has incorporated artificial intelligence into its biological weapons programs. Read that again. AI integrated into bioweapons development, the most powerful information technology ever created, applied to the most dangerous class of weapons humanity has conceived. This is the convergence the scientists at the Bulletin warned about. Artificial intelligence is not just spreading disinformation or controlling autonomous weapons. It is accelerating biological threats. The potential applications are numerous. AI can analyze genetic sequences to identify potential pathogens. It can model how modifications might enhance transmissibility or lethality. It can design molecules with specific biological effects. It can predict how immune systems might respond to novel threats. These capabilities have legitimate uses: drug discovery, vaccine development, understanding disease mechanisms. But the same tools that can design cures can design weapons. The line between healing and harm runs through the same technology. Researchers have already demonstrated concerning possibilities. In 2022, scientists at a pharmaceutical company showed that an AI system designed to predict drug toxicity could, with a small modification, generate designs for novel chemical weapons. In hours, the system produced thousands of potentially lethal compounds, some more toxic than any known agent. The researchers published their findings as a warning. They wanted to show how easily AI could be repurposed for harm, but the demonstration also revealed the dual-use nature of the technology. The same system that protects against toxicity can create it. Similar risks exist in biology. Large language models can provide information about pathogen characteristics, laboratory techniques, and weaponization methods. Some of this information is publicly available, some is restricted, but can be inferred or generated. The barrier to entry for bioweapons development is lowering. The Bulletin's 2026 statement cited AI tools that can help design biological threats as one of 4 factors increasing biological risk. The concern is not theoretical. It is based on demonstrated capabilities and documented research. Then there is the question of state-sponsored programs. Beyond the usual suspects of Russia, North Korea, and China, there are concerns about other nations. The treaty has no mechanism to investigate suspected violations, no penalties for non-compliance, no international body with the authority to inspect facilities or demand transparency. In December 2024, a meeting of Biological Weapons Convention members ended in acrimony. Russia blocked consensus on measures for international cooperation and scientific advice. The negotiations collapsed. The opportunity to strengthen the treaty was lost. Italy's lead negotiator summarized the failure with brutal honesty. If a biological weapon were to be used tomorrow, we would be caught completely unprepared. The world would look at us and would ask, "What have you done to prevent this?" The answer increasingly is not enough. The COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated what a naturally occurring pathogen can do. Millions dead, trillions in economic damage, social and political disruption that continues years later. and CO was not particularly lethal compared to historical diseases. Its fatality rate was measured in percentages, not tens of percentages. A deliberately engineered pathogen could be worse, much worse. Designed for transmissibility, designed for lethality, designed to evade vaccines and treatments, designed to spread before symptoms appear, maximizing the window for infection. The technology to create such agents exists. The knowledge is spreading. The safeguards are inadequate, and the international system designed to prevent biological weapons development is failing. There are additional concerns closer to home. The bulletin cited the dismantling of United States public health infrastructure as another factor increasing biological risk. Public health is the first line of defense against biological threats, whether natural or deliberate. Surveillance systems detect outbreaks, laboratories identify pathogens, epidemiologists trace transmission. Healthcare systems treat the sick. Rapid response capabilities contains spread. This infrastructure has been weakened. Budget cuts have reduced capacity. Political controversies have undermined public trust. Expertise has been lost. The pandemic exposed gaps that have not been filled. In a world where biological threats are multiplying, the systems designed to protect against them are shrinking. This brings us back to the fundamental challenge. Biology is becoming more accessible. The tools of biotechnology are spreading beyond traditional institutions. The information needed to manipulate life is increasingly available, and the oversight mechanisms are not keeping pace. Gene editing tools like CRISPR have democratized the ability to modify organisms. What once required specialized equipment and years of training can now be done with relatively modest resources. This has enormous benefits for research and medicine. It also has implications for biosecurity. Dual-use research is everywhere. The same techniques that could cure cancer could create pathogens. The same AI systems that could design life-saving drugs could design lethal agents. The line between beneficial and harmful applications runs through nearly every advance. Managing this dual-use challenge requires international cooperation. It requires transparency. It requires verification mechanisms that can distinguish peaceful research from weapons development. None of these exist in adequate form. The Biological Weapons Convention was supposed to provide this framework. Instead, it has become a hollow agreement. Nations sign it and then do as they please. Violators face no consequences. Compliance is assumed rather than verified. Scientists have proposed solutions. Transparency measures that would require disclosure of relevant research. International inspections with access to facilities. Attribution capabilities that could identify the source of a biological attack. Accountability mechanisms that would impose costs on violators. All of these face obstacles. Nations resist intrusion on their sovereignty. Intelligence agencies guard their sources and methods. Verification technologies are imperfect. Political will is lacking. The result is a gap, a growing gap between the threat and the response, between the capabilities that exist and the safeguards that contain them, between what biology can do and what international law prohibits. The 2026 Doomsday Clock assessment reflects this gap. It reflects the AI enhancement of biological weapons programs, the persistence of state programs despite treaty obligations, the vulnerability of public health systems, and the emergence of entirely new threats like mirror life. 85 Seconds to Midnight includes biology. It includes the recognition that advances in life science can be turned to destruction as easily as creation, that the Biological Weapons Convention is failing, that the barriers to bioweapons development are falling, that the next pandemic could be designed rather than natural. This is not cause for despair, it is cause for action. The scientists who study these threats believe they can be managed. Verification mechanisms can be built. International cooperation can be strengthened. AI can be governed. Mirror life can be prohibited, but action requires will, and will requires leadership. In the next chapter, we will examine why that leadership has been absent. Why the nations with the most power to address existential risks have chosen competition over cooperation. Why the systems designed to protect humanity are failing at the moment they are most needed. The failure of leadership. Chapter 9. The failure of leadership. The failure of leadership. There is a phrase that appears repeatedly in the Doomsday Clock statement for 2026. Failure of leadership. It is not a scientific term. It is not a technical assessment. It is a moral judgment, and it is the thread that connects everything we have examined. Nuclear arsenals are growing because leaders choose competition over cooperation. Climate change accelerates because leaders prioritize short-term interests over long-term survival. AI develops without adequate safeguards because leaders fear falling behind competitors. Biological weapons programs persist because leaders calculate that the benefits outweigh the risks of being caught. Every existential threat we have discussed could be reduced by human choice. The physics of nuclear weapons does not demand arms races. The chemistry of carbon dioxide does not require continued emissions. The algorithms of artificial intelligence can be governed. The biology of pathogens can be contained. The obstacle is not capability, it is will. The obstacle is not technology, it is politics. Alexandra Bell, president of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, made this explicit at the 2026 announcement. The Doomsday Clock is about global risks, she said, and what we have seen is a global failure in leadership. Consider the landscape she was describing. Russia under Vladimir Putin has become increasingly aggressive and isolated. The war in Ukraine continues with no end in sight. Moscow has explicitly and implicitly threatened nuclear use. It has suspended participation in arms control agreements. It has deployed new weapons designed to defeat Western defenses. It has used its energy resources as tools of coercion. It has spread disinformation through every available channel. Putin's government shows no interest in the cooperative arrangements that reduce nuclear risk after the Cold War. It views the international order as a threat to be undermined rather than a framework to be maintained. It calculates that Russia's interests are best served by disruption and confrontation. China under Xi Jinping has embarked on a massive expansion of military capabilities, including nuclear weapons. Beijing views American power as an obstacle to be overcome. It sees regional hegemony as its rightful position. It has become more assertive in the South China Sea, more threatening toward Taiwan, more willing to challenge the status quo. The Chinese government invests heavily in AI, including military applications. It pursues biotechnology with dual-use implications. It contributes to climate change while nominally supporting international agreements. Its transparency on any of these issues is minimal. The United States, the nation that helped build the post-war international order, is increasingly ambivalent about maintaining it. Political polarization has paralyzed domestic governance and undermined international credibility. Administrations alternate between engagement and withdrawal. Policies shift with elections. Allies are uncertain about American commitment. The Bulletin statement was particularly critical of American policy on climate. President Trump has essentially declared war on renewable energy and sensible climate policies, it said, relentlessly gutting national efforts to combat climate change. But the criticism extends beyond any single administration. American leadership on existential risks has been inconsistent for decades. Treaties are negotiated and then abandoned. Commitments are made and then reversed. The capacity for sustained long-term engagement on global challenges has atrophied. Daniel Holtz, chair of the Science and Security Board, put it simply: no matter the government, a shift toward neo-imperialism and an Orwellian approach to governance will only serve to push the clock toward midnight. This is not partisan commentary. It is an observation about trends that cross borders and ideologies. The rise of nationalism, the erosion of multilateralism, the prioritization of relative gains over absolute security, the willingness to impose costs on others even at expense to oneself. These trends are visible everywhere. in the refusal of major emitters to meet their climate commitments, in the abandonment of arms control frameworks, in the race to develop autonomous weapons without agreed rules, in the blocking of verification mechanisms for biological weapons, in the collapse of nuclear negotiations. International institutions that were designed to manage shared challenges are failing. The United Nations Security Council is paralyzed by great power vetoes. Climate conferences produce commitments that nations do not fulfill. Disarmament forums generate declarations without implementation. The architecture of cooperation built over decades is crumbling, and nothing is being built to replace it. Why? Why at the moment, when cooperation is most needed, are the world's most powerful nations retreating into competition? Part of the answer is structural. The international system has no enforcement mechanism for agreements among sovereign states. Nations can sign treaties and then ignore them. They can make promises and then break them. There is no global authority that can compel compliance. This has always been true, but in earlier eras, there were other forces that encouraged cooperation. Shared ideologies, common enemies, interlocking interests that made collaboration advantageous. The memory of catastrophic wars that concentrated minds on preventing the next one. Those forces have weakened. The Cold War is over, and with it, the existential threat that united the West. The generation that lived through World War II has largely passed. The belief that history moves toward greater cooperation and integration has been shaken. In its place has risen a different worldview, one that sees international relations as zero-sum competition, one that measures success in relative terms, whether we are ahead of rivals rather than absolute terms, whether we are safe. One that treats every agreement as a potential constraint to be evaded rather than a foundation to build upon. This worldview is not irrational. In a competitive environment, there are advantages to defection. The nation that cheats on arms control may gain military edge. The nation that ignores climate commitments may gain economic advantage. The nation that develops AI without restraint may gain technological dominance. But these are advantages measured against other nations. Against the existential risks we have discussed, they are meaningless. What good is military superiority if civilization collapses? What value is economic growth if the climate becomes uninhabitable? What point is technological dominance if the technology destroys everything? The failure of leadership is a failure to see beyond competition, a failure to recognize that some risks transcend rivalry, that some challenges require cooperation regardless of other disagreements, that survival itself depends on choices that no single nation can make alone. The scientists at the Bulletin understand this. They have understood it since 1945. That is why they created the clock, not to predict doom, but to prevent it, to focus attention on the choices that matter, to remind leaders that their decisions have consequences beyond borders and generations. But understanding is not enough. The scientists can identify the risks, they can explain the mechanisms, they can propose solutions. They cannot compel action. That requires political will, and political will requires leadership. Where might such leadership come from? History offers examples. The Cuban Missile Crisis, often cited as the closest the world came to nuclear war, was resolved through leadership. Kennedy and Khrushchev, despite deep ideological differences, found a way to step back from the brink. They chose survival over triumph. The ozone crisis of the 1980s was resolved through leadership. Scientists identified the threat. Nations negotiated the Montreal Protocol. Industry adapted. The ozone layer is recovering. A potential catastrophe was averted because leaders chose to act. Climate change itself has seen moments of leadership. The Paris Agreement, for all its limitations, represented a global commitment to address the threat. 200 nations agreed to limit warming. The framework for action was established. The failure is not in the agreement, but in the implementation. Leadership can emerge from unexpected places. Small nations can shame larger ones into action. Civil society can mobilize pressure. Scientists can provide the moral authority that comes from speaking truth to power. Young people can demand that their elders take seriously the world they will inherit. The Bulletin's statement emphasized this possibility. The problems the world faces can feel overwhelming, but they are human-made and still solvable. Solvable, that is the key word, not inevitable, not fated. Solvable, nuclear arsenals can be reduced, treaties can be, emissions can be cut, clean energy can be deployed, tipping points can be approached but not crossed, AI can be governed, international guidelines can be established, human control can be maintained. The race to autonomous weapons can be slowed, biological threats can be contained, the weapons convention can be strengthened, verification can be implemented, mirror life can be prohibited. All of these outcomes are possible. All of them have been achieved in analogous situations before. The question is not whether humanity can solve these problems. The question is whether it will choose to. The Doomsday Clock at 85 seconds to midnight is a measure of that choice. Not the choice of scientists or activists or ordinary citizens. The choice of leaders, the men and women who hold power, who command armies and economies, who sign treaties and break them, who could, if they wished, change the trajectory of history. So far they have not wished. So far they have chosen competition over cooperation, rivalry over survival, short-term advantage over long-term security. The clock measures the consequences of those choices. It measures the accumulated risk of decisions made and decisions deferred. It measures the narrowing margin between humanity and catastrophe. 85 seconds is not much time, but time in the metaphor of the clock is not the point. The point is the distance from midnight, the closeness of danger, the urgency of action. The scientists who set the clock believe that action is still possible. They believe that leadership can emerge. They believe that the trajectory can change. But they also believe that time is running out, that every year of delay makes the problems harder to solve, that the margin for error is shrinking, that eventually, if nothing changes, the clock will reach midnight. And midnight, in the metaphor of the clock, is the end. In the final chapter, we will step back and consider what all of this means, what ordinary people can do, what choices remain, and whether at 85 seconds to midnight, there is still hope. Chapter 10, 85 seconds to choose. We have traveled a long distance together, from the ashes of Hiroshima to the laboratories where scientists contemplate mirror life, from the frozen silos of nuclear missiles to the warming waters that are killing coral reefs, from the algorithms that spread lies to the machines that choose who dies. 85 seconds to midnight. The closest the Doomsday Clock has ever been to catastrophe, a symbol that has warned humanity for nearly 80 years, now warning more urgently than ever. What does it mean? What can be done? Is there still hope? Let us begin with what the clock does not mean. It does not mean the world will end in 85 seconds. It does not mean catastrophe is inevitable. It does not mean we should despair and abandon effort. The clock is not a countdown. It is a measure of accumulated risk, a representation of how close we stand to the capacity for self-destruction. The scientists who set the clock believe fundamentally in human agency. They believe that the problems they identify are human-made and therefore human-solvable. They believe that the trajectory can change, that the clock can move backward, that midnight can be avoided. This is not naive optimism. It is based on history. The clock has moved backward before. It moved backward after the Cuban Missile Crisis when Kennedy and Khrushchev stepped back from the brink. It moved backward after the end of the Cold War. When nuclear arsenals shrank and cooperation expanded, it moved backward when treaties were signed and honored. When leaders chose dialogue over confrontation, when humanity demonstrated that it could learn from its mistakes. In 1991, the clock stood at 17 minutes to midnight, the furthest it has ever been from catastrophe. That was possible because people made choices, because leaders acted, because the accumulated wisdom of a generation that had lived through 2 world wars and a Cold War found expression in agreements that reduced the risk of a third. If 17 minutes was possible, then why not again? If the clock can move forward, it can also move back. The direction depends on choices. Choices made by leaders, yes, but also choices made by citizens who pressure those leaders. By scientists who provide the knowledge, by activists who sustain the attention, by ordinary people who refuse to accept that catastrophe is inevitable. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist does not issue its annual warning to generate despair. It issues the warning to generate action, to focus attention, to remind humanity that the threats are real, but the responses are in our hands. What would it take to move the clock backward on nuclear weapons? The path is known. Resume negotiations between the United States and Russia on arms control. Extend or replace the New START Treaty. Establish verification mechanisms that rebuild trust. Engage China in dialogue about its expanding arsenal. Reduce the role of nuclear weapons in military doctrine. Extend warning times. Strengthen communication channels. Take weapons off hair trigger alert. None of this is technically difficult. All of it has been done before. The obstacle is not capability, but will. The obstacle is the belief that competition is more important than survival. On climate change, the path is equally clear. Accelerate the transition to clean energy. Phase out fossil fuels. Invest in renewable power, electric transportation, efficient buildings. Protect forests and restore ecosystems. Adapt to the changes that are already locked in. Prepare for the impacts that cannot be avoided. The technology exists. The economics increasingly favor clean energy. Solar and wind are now cheaper than coal and gas in most places. Electric vehicles are gaining market share. The transition is underway. It needs to be faster, much faster, but it is possible. On artificial intelligence, governance frameworks are emerging. The UN has engaged. Major nations have issued principles. The development of international guidelines for AI and military systems is proceeding slowly. The recognition that autonomous weapons require human control is spreading. The tools for managing AI exist. They need to be implemented on biological threats. The Biological Weapons Convention can be strengthened. Verification mechanisms can be established. Transparency measures can be implemented. The scientific community can draw lines around dangerous research. Mirror life can be prohibited before it is created. The regulatory gaps can be closed. On disinformation, media literacy can be improved. Platforms can be held accountable. Detection tools can be developed. Citizens can become more discerning consumers of information. The erosion of shared reality can be slowed and perhaps reversed. Each of these paths is difficult. Each faces obstacles. Each requires sustained effort over years and decades, but none is impossible. None requires technologies that do not exist. None demands capabilities beyond human reach. What is required is choice. The choice to prioritize survival over advantage, to cooperate despite competition, to invest in the future despite the pressures of the present. What can ordinary people do? First, understand the threats we have discussed are real. They are documented. They are the consensus of experts who have spent their careers studying these questions. Understanding them is the foundation for everything else. Second, engage. Democratic societies respond to citizen pressure. When enough people demand action, leaders act. When enough people vote for candidates who take existential risks seriously, those candidates win. When enough people support organizations that work on these issues, those organizations gain resources and influence. It is the outcome of choices, and choices can change. Fourth, maintain perspective. The daily news cycle emphasizes immediate crisis, political scandals, economic fluctuations, cultural controversies. These matter, but they do not matter as much as the existential risks that could end civilization. Keeping that perspective even when it is unfashionable is essential. Fifth, support the institutions that work on these problems. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, climate research organizations, arms control advocacy groups, science education initiatives. These institutions need support. Financial support, political support, moral support. The scientist who created the Doomsday Clock understood something fundamental. Knowledge is not enough. The facts do not speak for themselves. Someone must interpret them. Someone must communicate them. Someone must translate technical assessments into messages that reach ordinary people and political leaders. That is what the clock does. It takes complex interconnected risks and reduces them to a single image. A clock approaching midnight, a symbol anyone can understand, a warning that cuts through the noise. For nearly 80 years, the clock has performed this function. It has attracted attention, generated debate, focused minds. It has not prevented all the dangers it warned about, but it has contributed to the awareness that makes prevention possible. The scientists continue this work because they believe it matters. Because they believe that human beings informed of the risks can choose differently. Because they believe that the future is not determined by the past. Because they believe in the possibility of wisdom. 85 seconds to midnight is a warning. It is also an invitation to engage with the most important questions humanity has ever faced, an invitation to participate in the choices that will determine whether civilization survives. The clock does not know what you will choose. It only measures the consequences of choices already made. The choices still to come will determine whether it moves forward or back, whether midnight approaches or recedes, whether the warning becomes a prophecy or remains what it was meant to be, a call to action. We began this journey with a question. What does it mean that the Doomsday Clock stands at 85 seconds to midnight? It means we are in danger, real danger, documented danger. The combined weight of nuclear weapons, climate change, artificial intelligence, biological threats, and failing institutions has never been greater. The margin for error has never been smaller. The need for action has never been more urgent. But it also means we are still here, still capable of choice, still possessed of the knowledge to identify the risks and the tools to address them, still human with all the capacity for wisdom and folly that implies. The scientists who set the clock do not know whether humanity will choose wisely. They know only that the choice is ours, that the future is not written, that the clock can move in either direction. 85 seconds to midnight, 85 seconds to choose. What will you choose? If you found this investigation valuable, please like and subscribe. Your support makes these detailed explorations possible. And tell me in the comments, what do you think we should do? What gives you hope? What concerns you most? What should we investigate next? The threats we have discussed are real, but so is the possibility of response. The clock measures risk. It does not determine fate. That determination remains, as it always has, in human hands. Thank you for watching. I will see you in the next